Salmon, directly from Frankfurt, Germany, and joining us today. So Janet, very excited to have you with us. Janet is currently the Chief Product Owner for Management Accounting, working with development teams in Germany and China to design, develop, and test new editions of SAP S/4HANA Finance. And she is an end-to-end process owner for financial planning and analysis, working with customers from around the globe to understand their strategy and needs and adopt software accordingly. She has experienced firsthand what a finance transformation means for SAP customers across all industries and geographies, and she'll share her experience in her presentation today. Janet, thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise and insights with our global audience.
Thank you.
Looks good.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk about SAP's vision of finance transformation. So I'm going to talk first of all about the changing role of finance. Now, Jose didn't say, but I've actually been in the finance space for about 30 years now. And when I joined SAP, finance was really known for being pretty backward looking. Of course, we were out there trying to persuade customers that moving to SAP would make them more efficient, more robust, have better processes in place. But really, the truth of it was, even at that time, people were closing in 15 days. One of my favorite stories was of a customer that said they had an ERP system that was holding together 500 spreadsheets. That's not really where we wanted to be at that time. And I'm going to try and walk you through the way I think the role of finance is changing, the way the expectations of finance are changing. If you think what we've just been through in the last year, crisis is everywhere. People want finance to tell them how to react, what to do, and not just to be the people in the back office scrabbling to get the local close into place. I want to look at the way we're working with customers now on better ways of steering the business. These are really critical decisions. How do you organize your company? How do you compare? How do you ensure comparability? And also a question that I find a lot of the customers that I talk with asking at the moment is, am I actually still in the business I was when I did my initial implementation maybe 15, 20 years ago? In some cases, it's obvious. We hear about the sort of the Ubers, the Airbnbs, the guys who weren't there 20 years ago. But I think it's just as important to look at traditional brick and mortar type companies and say, how's the world changing for them? And do they still have the systems in place to help them steer the business? If you've been following the SAP space recently, you'll also have heard a lot about HANA and how we're doing things faster, changing the system architecture. As a finance person, that tends to not wow you that much. One of the other things we're doing equally is actually redesigning our user interfaces. And I'm a mom with 2 kids. I don't think my kids are going to sit in a training center for 6 months like I did and learn how to use an SAP system. They want it to be intuitive. They want it to speak their language. They want to be able to chat while they're entering transactions. It's a completely different world from a user perspective. My kids aren't at all scared of being involved in a system, of interacting with a system, but they feel the system should reach out and help them and not block them with strange error messages and things that they just don't understand. I'll talk a little bit about finance as the core of the business and what we're doing around things like new technologies, artificial intelligence, and so on. And then the way different customers that I've been working with have been approaching a transformation. But up front, I'd just like to say there's not one way to do it. I think I've seen every flavor that's out there, just depending on where you're coming from and what it is you're trying to achieve with your transformation. And then I'll wrap up and take your questions. So we'll start with the changing role of finance. And if you think about it, as I say, when I started, it was very much about daily routine. It was about that operations piece. And you've probably seen variants of this slide over the years. People like the Hackett Group used to go out and say what a wonderful thing it would be if we could go from being 80% operational and 20% insights to exactly the other way around, that we had 80% insights and 20% operations. And I think the vision is easy, but the doing it is difficult. It's important to understand where you are today. What is it that makes that operational piece so difficult? Is it that you've got very fragmented systems? So I've worked with a lot of financial service companies over the years that don't even bring their general ledger data into their system till a day after the period is closed. You're not going to get real-time insights if you don't even have the data in your SAP system until day one of the following period. I then people that have got a lot of fragmented systems. I work with a lot of German customers who tell me, well, I have 35 SAP systems. I say, great. But then I have to bring them into one common data warehouse, one consolidation system to actually get the big picture, to see where I stand. And then, of course, there's the automation piece. And it's very easy to get taken away by all these new technologies and all these fantastic new things that are coming out. But often you really need to go back to the bread and butter and say, well, when I capture my data, how good is the quality up front? Can I do certain checks on it as I capture it? Can I make sure that the profit centers are right? Can I make sure that some of that structural information is right? Before I then try to make decisions on that data. Because if you think of what a lot of the people were doing 20 years ago when we said, why are your operations taking up 80% of your time in finance? It wasn't just keying in data. It was doing an awful lot of checking and matching and looking at the information in table A, match the information in table B, match the information in table C. And I'll show you that as SAP, we've redesigned our system so that you've got a single source of truth, but that single source of truth is as good as the data that you manage to get into it. So let's say you've done that, you've managed to get that operations piece much, much smaller. You've suddenly got the ability to get those real-time insights. And one of the challenges here is really to make sure you've got the structure in place so that you don't have to do a whole lot of transformation to get to the data that you'd really like to understand. What happened a lot 20 years ago was that people started to put in data warehouses. They were doing their local operational information in SAP systems and other ERP vendors. And then they were putting a layer on top that was transforming it into a common chart of accounts, a common profit center structure, a common way of looking at the products and customers, which was great. It maybe gave them insights that they didn't have before. But that transformation in itself was slowing them down. It was stopping them really understanding where they were making their money, where they were driving that business. And so one thing we're trying to do is trying to get to a situation where in your finance system today, you capture the data at source the way you'd like to have it, rather than doing a lot of transformations and heavy lifting afterwards. And of course, predictions 20 years ago, pretty minimalistic. And what we're now trying to do is get to a situation where that analytics piece is really much better, where we can be more proactive in our business steering and really use the information that we have to drive the business going forward. So that's maybe one way of looking at SAP's vision of a transformation. Another is a way of seeing finance as two different sides to the same coin. Jose said, I work with customers all over the world, a lot of them the big globals. And one of the challenges is for the big globals is which side of this balance wins? Of course, we have to handle all our local gaps. If you're operating in India, if you're operating in Russia, if you're operating in China, we have to be able to handle those global accounting principles. We have to handle the local currencies in that company. We have to handle the just simple requirements like, where's your fiscal year? What does your calendar look like? We have to be able to deliver that legal reporting for each of those local entities. What you often find, though, is that by focusing on that side of the business, those individual requirements in each of the countries that you're operating in, you end up with this data warehouse requirement to get everything into a common store. So you can actually compare like with like. So most of the German companies that I'm looking for are looking for an equivalent system where they've got IFRS as a global common accounting principle for all the units that they're in, not just the European ones. So give them their double accounting view. They want to have a group currency in addition to all those local currencies. So if you're headquartered in the US, it might not be IFRS as the leading accounting principle. You might say that you want everybody to work with US GAAP and everybody to work with US dollars. And you've got this double requirement then. to have a set of accounts that's in US GAAP for everybody, US dollars for everybody, but also supports the fact that you're operating in Canada and Mexico as well, and you need to be handling Canadian GAAP, Mexican GAAP, and so on, and of course Canadian dollars, Mexican pesos, and so on. And of course, you want everybody working on the same calendar there as well. You want those key figures to be speaking one language across the organization. And there isn't a right and wrong here. I think both sides are equally valid. And you'll find some companies that have been very strong on putting in a corporate chart of accounts, putting in common reporting structures, and maybe struggling a little bit and doing a lot of manual work on the local side of things, or they've been very strong locally, and then they end up doing a lot of manual work at period close to get that common view. And what we're trying to get to with our customers nowadays is to get to having the best of both worlds out of one system. But I think before you undertake a transformation, you have to understand where you as an organization stand here. Which one of those camps do you feel you're more strongly in? And of course, you're almost certainly in both. The other thing that I ask people to do is to actually ask, are they still in the same business that they were in when they first implemented SAP? And if you read a lot of the business press, you'll see all about the Ubers and the Airbnbs and all the organizations that weren't even there 10 years ago. And of course, I'm not knocking those. I think it's fantastic that they've been able to enter the business and be so successful. But I think the lesson learned can also be from some of the more traditional businesses that have actually evolved and changed. So I like to talk about Kaiser Compressors or John Deere, because they're very much a traditional business. Kaiser Compressors, essentially, it's make to order. It's a very engineering heavy business. John Deere Tractors, again, a very engineering heavy traditional business. But what they've both done is they've tried to turn around the way they work. So of course, they still make tractors, they still make compressors. But Kaiser Compressors sells you air as a service. It handles the way you deal with that air, rather than simply giving you a machine and saying, off you go, get on with it. The same with John Deere. They're working with us to actually predict when you need maintenance on your tractor. Working with farmers in terms of the fields and what sort of service do you need to support you there. It's a completely different way of saying, here's a massive capital investment. Maybe we'll lend you the money to have that tractor. You'll actually find that a lot of these big engineering companies also have a banking solution to help them support their customers in dealing with these big expenses. And now they're going to a different world again, where it's not even a question of making or buying or leasing a tractor. It's actually about borrowing some of that big capital expense equipment when you need it. Another company that I've worked a lot with over the years has been Under Armour. And in principle, they're a retailer. They make sports clothing. Nothing very exciting about that. But what they've done on top is they've done a lot of work to connect with the individual athletes, to understand what their individual runners, football players, whatever they are, what they need, what they use. So it becomes more than just a question of buying a new shirt. They're using the data they're collecting to suggest that your running shoes might be wearing out and it might be time to invest in a new pair of running shoes. So it's maybe time to just think who you are, what you're doing, where you're coming from. And I've got two customers that I've actually presented with over the years. One is Ringier, which is they're actually a Swiss digital service. They were originally newspapers and so on. And I think it's really easy to see with an example like that you've got a very traditional business. When they started out with SAP, they're based out of Switzerland. They were one of the very first customers to implement SAP outside of Germany. And in those days, they were selling magazines, they were selling newspapers. Their job was to make sure all those newspapers and magazines were in the shops and in the stations, so that when people went to work, they could pick up that physical newspaper and read it. And of course, they still do physical newspapers, but they're now very much about digital content and managing that content. And if you think about what that means for finance, it's a complete change to the business. They're no longer working just with the wholesalers that would put out that print information to the shelves for us to pick it up. They're working with each and every one of us who has a subscription to one of their magazines. It's completely changing the volume of data that they have to bill for. It's completely changing their customer processes. and I realize we're in a financial service environment here, but I think it's still worth stopping and thinking, am I still offering the products that I had before? And am I still serving the customers the way I did before? Another customer that I've presented with in the past is Balance Agri-Nutrients down in New Zealand. And they started off, they were making fertilizer essentially. Pretty standard, making a physical product, getting it to the wholesalers, and the farmers would come along and buy the agri-nutrients. But what they now do is they have a management system for you to manage your fields. So they'll help you to decide what fertilizer makes sense, when you should be putting it on the fields. They'll lend you the equipment to help you do these things. It's a totally different experience of how you deal with the customer. And of course, they're again dealing with the end customer, the individual farmers, rather than the big wholesalers that used to sell their fertilizers. And these may be quite extreme examples, but I think they're very helpful in terms of seeing what maybe you were doing 20 years ago and what you're doing today, and how the two can be radically different. But other customers that I work with haven't changed so much in the way their business is. The oil and gas companies are still getting oil and gas out of the ground and providing it to the consumer. Same with the energy customers. There's not a huge difference in the business per se, but what's happening is that finance are being asked to do less with more. And then it's about looking for inefficiencies in the process. So I presented with Veolia in Australia last year, and it was all about getting some common practices in place, getting away from some of those fragmented processes, getting everybody talking the same language, and getting away from those inefficiencies that come from the fact that your data's lumpy, that people are doing things different ways, that they're not handling things the common way. The same with Engie, an energy company. They had a lot of manual stuff that they were doing. It's just not the most efficient way to run the business. And of course, as things get hard, we can't afford to do that sort of thing anymore. We can't afford to have 20 people that are managing spreadsheets and trying to manipulate and morph and handle data. We want to capture it clean. We want to capture it with good quality, and then be able to act on that the minute we've captured that data. So with that basic idea in place, I hope you've got an idea maybe of what sort of business you're in and how much it's changed over the years. And now I'd like to ask the question of how you steer your business. And these can be the three drivers for a change. It's important to understand the organization itself. Now, of course, I'm SAP. I don't go in and change your organization. I don't even go to make recommendations about maybe you should change your organization. But I get customers coming to me and say, you know, the company structure that we set up, we did it because of this, that, or the other, but it's not actually that useful anymore. The way we set up our profit centers, the way we set up our business segments, it's not really the way we want to run our business nowadays. And I'll then sit down and work with them about what do they want to do? How do they want to organize their business? You know, have they got lots and lots of different charts of accounts? They want to get to a common accounting structure. Have they got profit centers that are all over the place? They want to get to a common profit center structure. And then if you think what I just talked about in terms of changing business models, often we'll find that the products and services have changed. So 20 years ago, when SAP first started to go to market with the idea of an industry solution, we had very much the physical products, the chemical products, the engineering products and so on. And then we had the service industry. So we were thinking about the banks and the insurance companies and so on. And the two were kind of worlds apart. Okay, so somebody like John Deere would sell you a tractor and would have a banking solution to help you borrow the money for it. But even there, they were two solutions that didn't really meet that much. And now we're seeing those two coming back together. What you're seeing is not just a car company making cars, but a car company that wants to sell you a mobility service and wants to manage that mobility service and all the upgrades that go with it. Those two worlds are moving much closer together. And that's often a driver for change, to say, can I actually manage the situation that I have with the system I have in place today? We'll often find that there's people are using different SAP systems to handle their production and their service environment, just because that's historically how they've done it. And then they have a massive disconnect between the product being finished, the car rolling off the production line, and any services that you have with respect to that car later. The other thing we see changing is the way people deal with the customer. So a lot of the clothes companies, for example, that I've worked with, other fashion companies, their job used to be to get that fashion into the stores. The stores were the wholesalers. And then you and I, the consumer, went down to the stores and we bought the items of clothing. And now, of course, things are changing. We do still occasionally go into a store, less and less at the moment for obvious reasons. We'll find that some of those have actually opened their own retail spaces because they want to control that space rather than just being part of a big store. And almost everybody now has gone online. They've got some kind of online experience. And the idea, of course, which has been particularly useful for almost all of us in the last year, is that we can make all those purchases online if we want to. And then comes the challenge for the retailer to understand what their market is. Their market is maybe less about looking, is it better to have a store in this part of downtown, and more about how do I reach that consumer in that particular segment. It's changing the way we segment our customers. It's changing the way we understand people's buying procedures. When I talked about the local versus the corporate, about the challenge of the currencies, and almost everybody I work with now is wanting to go for this double view, this corporate currency, and then the local currencies that they need in their individual countries that they're operating in. What they're also often doing is they're trying to go to a double way of looking at their books. The one from the local legal reporting point of view that's saying, what's my business looking like in Mexico? What's it looking like in Canada? How does it look like in the US? And then this corporate view that says, let's imagine that I'd already consolidated. Let's imagine that everything's already transformed into the same structure. How does that look today? If we think about data itself, obviously we tend to think of finance as being about capturing your actual business transactions. And of course, that's the baseline. Without that, we can do nothing. But it's also important to understand how you plan. How easy is it to plan? Do you plan in some completely separate system? Or do you plan using data already captured in your actuals? How do you make predictions? And again, that's something that's very driven by your industry that you're in. So a consumer product company might be able to see predictions sort of a couple of weeks, a couple of months out. Car companies maybe a little longer. And in financial services, if you're an insurance company, you can often predict really quite well where you are because you've got all these long-running contracts with people. So it's about understanding your contractual information and saying how much does that allow me to predict the future. And then also to understand your steering levels. Are you trying to optimize the individual legal entities, or are you trying to optimize as a group? And I have a lot of discussions with customers at the moment about how to get that group view in parallel with the local legal view, because they're both important, but they drive completely different decisions at times. So in terms of our product, what have we just done with SAP S/4HANA is we've taken those organizational structures, the products, the services, the customers, and we've brought them all into one space. This universal journal is really just an enormous pivot table. So historically, we had lots of very fragmented applications in accounting. So we had general ledger accounting, cost center accounting, project accounting, profitability analysis, profit center accounting, also all over the place, different ledgers, different structures. And we brought them all into one place. So all those entities are just a column in a table, which you can select. The idea being that I'm looking at revenue for the company code France, I'm looking at revenue for a customer group XYZ, and they're just different aggregations of the same data. And then we have these separate views that allow us to say, which currency are you looking at? Do you want the entity view or the local or the group view? Do you want predictive data? It's all very much cleaned up and tidied up and ready to go. So the idea being that we're capturing all those individual entities in the universal journal. And the idea is that, of course, you don't just capture actuals, you also want to put a plan, you want to set a target, you want to understand for each of those entities, where do you want to go? And that can be organizational goals. So you want goals for your legal entities, goals for your segments, goals for your profit centers. And also goals for those nitty-gritty pieces. How much do I want to grow within a particular product? How much do I want to grow within a particular customer segment? And of course, we want those two views to line up. So the planning table is essentially just a derivative of our actual table. And then on top, we've got the group view, where we're trying to say, how do we want to steer the business as a whole? And of course, that won't have all 340 fields that you would have for actual operational accounting, but it will have those consolidated entities that you report outside at group level. And I think that's a very important piece. And if you think about that very first slide I showed, where I say what's going on in operations, we're often very focused on that bottom level, on getting everything into the local accounts correctly. And then we end up doing a lot of lifting and transformation to get that group view. And what I tell people now going into a transformation is to really think about the three areas together. So think about your requirements for consolidation, think about your requirements for local legal reporting, and think about your requirements for controlling, and make sure you have all those entities in that base layer. So it's then easy to perform the eliminations and get that corporate view without having to do lots of heavy lifting at period close, because that will take time out of your close. So what happened fairly early on is we fairly quickly got people doing their local close in 2 days, but they were still often taking 15 days to get to their group close. And that's a long time to be waiting for real-time information that when you could have real-time information that you could be acting on. One of the other transformations I see, though, is nothing to do with data and data quality. It's about making the information that we collect actionable. Oops. And one of the things we've been doing a lot of in recent times is what we call the SAP Fiori initiative. The idea is really a user-driven design approach that makes it really easy to consume this information. So it's quite important to think about all the cost center managers, the project managers, all those people that are out there that are responsible for spending. And we don't want to send them an email once a month saying, hey, you really ought to look at your figures, your budget's way off. We want to give them the sort of reports that are really easy to consume, that are graphical, that are really easy to use. And this is just one sample report for managing project costs. The idea being that you've got the selection area up the top where you can select what it is you want to look at. You can then dig down into some of these standard visualizations. And then the thing that I think is really powerful is that you can see the line items behind that. I mean, people have been showing dashboards at conferences for years, and yeah, they all look very, very nice and pretty, but it's when I can really drill down and see that it's that document that drove that number, that it's that combination of documents that's leading to that number that just looks wrong, that can't be right, or maybe it is right because there's something out there that I haven't realized. That's when that information becomes actionable, and I start to trust those figures because I can act on them and really interrogate it and understand what's out there. I have to say, this is actually my favorite Fiori application. I've spent the last 30 years drawing T accounts on whiteboards, trying to explain to people what we're posting when, what's on the left, what's on the right. And this is taking any single document that's being posted as a journal entry and visualizing it the way an accountant sees it. So, if I think back to my early days at SAP, I was sitting in the training center with accountants. They were all qualified accountants. They all knew how you posted these things or how you accounted for these things. But the whole act of trying to understand how we stored the data and how we put it into the system was like learning a foreign language to them. And this is really coming to an accountant and speaking their language. And I think as part of a finance transformation project, that's really important to make information actionable. You saw that project report. If you can't make sense of that as a project manager, you're maybe in the wrong job. If it's an accountant, you can't immediately grasp what's going on in this screen, you're maybe in the wrong job. And this is something else that I've actually loved. It's maybe not the best example for financial services, but the idea is it walks you through a textbook process. So you've got an inquiry, you've got a quotation, you've got a sales order, you've made a delivery, you've maybe made a transfer, you've got credits. And what's happening up the top is the logistics flow. And at the bottom, you've got the document flow as it's showing up in the GL. It's really easy to understand what's going on in the outside world, how that's showing up in finance. And I appreciate that maybe this isn't the best example for the financial service people who are out there watching, because that real world is what you typically do in your own back-end systems. But I still really like it as a way that SAP is going with its user interfaces. The other one I like is this idea of intelligent goods receipt and invoice receipt. Now, the problem has been around for years. You capture a goods receipt, you capture an invoice receipt, and there's some kind of difference in place. But focus less on the problem and more how we've been trying to solve this problem. So this started off just as an analytical application. We tried to collect the information that we thought was relevant. We visualized it. We make it easy for people to act on it. And gradually we started working with shared service centers to understand these smart facts. What are the typical things that go wrong? And actually, there's only about half a dozen things that go wrong. The amount in the invoice is wrong. The quantities are wrong. There's either a goods receipt missing or an invoice receipt missing. And we started to use the system to simulate what people were doing manually before. So they were chasing the vendor. They were trying to do manual write-offs. And we're using the system to watch what the user's been doing and then make proposals. In principle, it's no different from what happens when you make a purchase with Amazon or something, that they try to suggest, if you bought the things on my bookshelf, you probably also want another book of this kind. Here we're trying to make suggestions. But the idea is that we free up time, we use the information, we use the actions that you've already done to try and drive future business, drive future decisions. If we think about finance as the core, I think it's very easy to think of finance as just something that happens at the end of the process. We collect all the pieces and trying to put it in one place. But it's very important to get that record to report process clean, to capture the data reliably in the first place, to improve the data quality. It then takes time out of your financial accounting process because you've done it right up front. Managing the financial close is all about really understanding the steps, understanding the dependencies, really treating it like a project and trying to really pin down what needs to be done and how. And then, of course, to be able to act on that. As we get into management accounting, we become more open in terms of what kind of cost center structures do you need? What kind of profit center structures do you need? In margin analysis, what is it you're actually looking at? And maybe a key takeaway for those of you who are watching from a financial service point of view. Historically, you've often only had things like cost center accounting and project accounting in your SAP system. And you've done all that nitty-gritty analysis of, who's buying my life insurance, who's doing this, that, and the other in a separate system because of the granularity of the data. And we're now working with customers like you to bring that information into the general journal, to be more granular and to have that more nitty-gritty detail about what you're spending with whom. And then, of course, it's about planning and target setting and setting up predictions. So if you think of those as the two core processes, and as I said, the big innovation with S4 is that we're putting it all into one place, into this universal journal. We've got a new data platform. So if you've heard about SAP HANA, the idea is that can really capture data in real time. It can give you those drill downs. You can combine transactional and analytical data on one system. And of course, I'm working then with a lot of customers to try and bring a lot of the stuff that they used to do in a data warehouse down into that operational system. Once you've got that bread and butter information in place, you can then start to bring in some of these intelligent technologies. So you can start to bring in the predictive analytics. You can try and use the patterns that you have in your data to predict what's going to happen. The machine learning is sitting behind things like the goods receipt, invoice receipt clearing, and watching what somebody's been doing. And of course, you can do that with open receivables, cash, and so on as well, just to try and predict what a human's been doing and try and predict the way forward there. And we're also trying to improve the user interface, not just in terms of the Furies that I showed you, but in trying to give you alerts, make you aware of what's happening, provide you that business context, which was often missing in some of the old transactions. People would often spend 2-3 years really trying to make sense of the data that we were giving them. And We just haven't time for that now. None of us have time to spend 6 months learning how to use an SAP system and then another 2 years to really understand what we're seeing there. That sort of thing has to happen really quickly. So just to give you an idea of some of the latest automation systems, we go pretty much across the board. I've been focusing very much on accounting and financial planning and analysis, but we've also got predictions going on in Treasury around the cash and liquidity forecasting, around the operational side of things. So trying to automate the dispute process and the cash collection process, to automate customer payment and credit scoring and so on. There's a lot of things happening out there. And if you're interested, definitely dive a little bit more into that. They're maybe not where you think SAP's strength has been in the past, but that's definitely where we're going. But when it comes to transformation, I think it's quite important to get the basics right. If you've not got good data underneath, then trying to put a prediction on top really is not going to help you a whole lot. One of the other big questions that's going on a lot at the moment is the question cloud or on-premise. Obviously, we have both solutions. And I don't think it necessarily has to be an either or. An either or, it can be a both. I also work with customers who say, in headquarters where we've got these really challenging environment, we need that flexibility that an on-premise system gives us. We're not ready to go to the cloud there. We don't think you can handle it yet. But we've got a small unit out in wherever. We need some local finance out wherever, and we're going to do that in the cloud. So we're going to experiment with a couple of entities and maybe use those in the cloud as well. And that brings, of course, its own challenges in the sense of bringing those two systems together, allowing them to share data so that I really get a common view. And of course, it's not just about finance systems there. You get the same discussions going on in terms of what kind of an HR system do you want, what kind of manufacturing system do you want, and so on. So how have people been approaching a transformation? Certainly the last 5 years, I've been talking to an awful lot of customers about transformation. And of course, there are many, many ways to skin a cat. The simplest way is simply to do a conversion. So SAP themselves, we've been running our own SAP system for years and years, certainly for as long as I've been at SAP, which is nearly 30 years. And in 2015, we just took our existing corporate system and we moved it to S/4HANA. So we converted the database. We did a conversion to move the separate accounting applications into the one table. And that was us going forward. We were able to go to Sapphire and say, hey, we do it, we run our own system. And I've seen other customers do that as well. Others are looking at their existing systems, and this question doesn't have to just apply to an SAP system. It can apply to any ERP system you might have there. And they're saying, a lot of the decisions that we made back in 1995, they just don't hold anymore. Our legal entities are all over the place. Our profit center structures don't make sense. Our cost centers are not where we want them to be. We've put in controlling areas that are just too small. We've got a one-to-one relationship between our company codes and our controlling areas. If we only knew today, if we'd only known then what we know today, we would have built a different system. And a lot of those customers are actually doing a new implementation. Some of them are going on premise, some of them are going into the cloud. But the idea is just to really understand what's the art of the possible. What could you do if you really started again? And then, of course, there's plenty of landscape transformations going on. The people with the 35 separate ERP systems are maybe not trying to get down to one system, but they're trying to bring several different systems together and reduce that complexity. So in terms of a system conversion, plenty of people have done it, plenty of tools out there to do it. I think the important thing with a system conversion is you can still spend quite a lot of money doing a migration, moving data from one system to another. And to get a benefit from it, you really need to understand where you want to go, what you want to change. So SAP themselves, as I said, did a conversion pretty early on, but we then went back and said, the way we do profit center accounting today in a separate data store, that's not really the way we want to do it going forward. And they moved that profit center analysis into the universal journal, into that one piece, so that everybody's really using that single source of truth going forward. And we do these constant iterations to try and squeeze a little bit more out of our own implementation. So although it might seem that it was a one-stop, we went from A to B in 2015 and then we stopped, we've actually done a lot of iterations since to get to a leaner, meaner, more efficient way of running our own systems. I'm working with a lot of customers who've been doing, obviously, a new implementation if you didn't run SAP before, but also people who are taking their own legacy SAP. And sometimes that's because they've grown by acquisitions. They've got several very, very different SAP implementations out there, different system structures out there. And they've tried to get them speaking a common language so that they can really compare like with like. So the typical things that we find people doing is they're changing the way they handle their currencies, they're changing the way they structure their profit centers, they're changing the way they really steer their business using the data that they're collecting. And of course, I can't tell you if this is right for you. It really depends where you're coming from and what history, what legacy you have. In fact, one of the best practices that I heard was one of the customers that I work with. They actually brought back the people who were still in the same organization from their original implementation and asked them, what are the things you wished you'd known back in 1995? Because those are the things we're going to try and change. Those are the things we're going to try and sort out. And I thought that was a really nice way of learning from the past rather than just flinging the baby out with the bathwater and hoping that there would be this magic transformation that would make everybody happy. And then, of course, we also have these landscape transformations, many, many different reasons to do it. But the idea is we have tools that will allow you to select the data and move it into a new system, whether that's an existing SAP system or a legacy system, and to transform it, enrich it, make it future-proof. So if I had to try and wrap this up before we go into questions, and I hope people have been asking lots of questions in the chat, I don't think a finance transformation is ever an end in itself. I think the question you've got to ask is, are you still in the same business? Do you actually need to change? And what's driving change? And there can be two things that can drive change. The one can be the business world has actually changed. If you think about the car companies, you're not just physically making a car and hoping somebody buys it. You're selling a car with the mobility services and all the things on top that go with it. You're changing the world. You think about the newspapers, you're changing the way you do business. There's still things from the past that are in there, but there's also very definitely things that have changed. The other is just pure efficiency. Have you grown from mergers and acquisitions? Your finance structures are all over the place, and that's actually getting in the way of really running your business efficiently. Do you need to change those structures? Do you need to get everybody speaking the same language? And then the question of, how do you steer your business and how real time is the information that you have today? And of course, is finance able to help you to steer that business with the information that you're collecting? And if the answer there is no or no, not really, then you're merely looking at a transformation. I think it's also important to ask how you work. I often ask people to show me their spreadsheets because that's where I find all the sort of nitty-gritty, dirty workarounds that people are doing, because they're not capturing the data that they need, or because they're doing all sorts of manual work to try and reconcile things that should be inherently in one place. The other interesting thing I've been finding at SAP is as we've been hiring younger colleagues, they don't want to work with transaction codes anymore. They don't want to work with menus. They want to work with Fioris that reach out and make things just more tangible and more easy to understand. And I think we have to respect that. And as an organization, as SAP, we try to support them in that work. But of course, you've got to be realistic as well. There aren't infinite resources out there. There aren't infinite resources to change finance or to rebuild your IT systems. Those hugely expensive projects that maybe were around 30 years ago, nobody can afford to do that anymore. It's often about tweaking a system, trying to make it more meaningful as you go along, and really have good goals in place so you can get where you want to be. For those of you who've liked what you heard before I open for questions, recommend a couple of my books. So if you're really interested in the nitty-gritty technical stuff, have a look at my book about first steps in SAP S/4HANA Finance. If you're more interested in the business things and why we think the world of finance is changing, the reference guide to what's new will help you understand how we think the finance world's changing and what we think maybe could help. And with that, I'd like to open up for questions.
Janet, thank you so much for your presentation. You covered so much ground in a topic that is so critical for so many organizations. We are right at the time to wrap up here. So I'm going to ask you one question there was an overall theme from the audience. And if you can give me like a minute answer on that. You have been doing this for quite some time. I remember myself, like mid 1990s, my first ERP implementation, and the experience is always painful to a certain extent, and to a certain extent is because of the technology itself, but to a lot of it, to a great extent, it is because of what you mentioned, that the implementation of this technology forces the business to ask some very fundamental questions, and those fundamental questions are just really hard. And whether or not it's the faults of the ERP system gets blamed for unearthing some of that stuff. So as we move 30 years into where we are today, when you look at success factors today for implementing ERP systems, if you could give me like a couple of the key success factors that you say, if you want to set up yourself for success, there's a couple of things that you need to do to get started.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right that SAP gets the blame for being mega complicated. And actually, it's mega complicated because the reality out there is mega complicated. And the challenge is to get stakeholders in the business who really know what they want to see, how they want to structure that information, what the segments of the business really are, how you want to organize it, how you want to split things up, and can get people to talk one language. And if I think about the challenges of just something simple like changing a chart of accounts, the challenge is partly technical, but it's also a business challenge. What is it you want to see? How do you want to organize it? And of course, I'm kind of pushing the problem to everybody else and saying, well, if you tell me what you want to do, I'll help you do it. But I think if you don't know what you want to do, you can waste a lot of time going around in circles. The most successful implementations are the ones where somebody's really sat down up front and said, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to achieve, this is how I want to structure my company, this is how I want to structure my finance. And then it's just a question of ticking all the boxes and getting everything to fit into that system. And if every time you revisit those same questions and maybe we could do it differently, maybe we should reorganize it, and maybe that's not the right way to do it, it's just like walking in quicksand. So of course, it's maybe easy for somebody from SAP to say, if you know exactly what you want to do, I'll help you do it. But I think that is the key to a successful project, is to really know what you want to do, what it is you're trying to transform, what the business problem is you're trying to solve, and then to make that happen, rather than going into endless discussions about, well, we could do it this way, that way, or the other way.
That is terrific insight. It's the clarity of purpose and alignment in the organization that you have highlighted as critical. Janet, thank you so much for taking the time for sharing this expertise and experience with us. We will ask the audience to go into LinkedIn and post any questions that you may have there that you didn't get answered during the presentation. And what is another way that the audience can get hold of you? Is there a best way that we can follow your work somehow?
I mean, you'll see me on LinkedIn. I do update things there. I'm actually working on a new book as well, she said shamelessly. You've got my email there as well if you've got very specific questions about SAP implementations or any project you might be involved in.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the over 2,000 registered participants on Financial Services Live, a big thank you for taking the time to share your expertise from Germany to the world on enterprise resource planning systems and SAP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose, and thank you very much to everybody who's been listening. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Janet Salmon, who is leader, chief product owner for management accounting at SAP, and really guided us through a journey of the why, the what, the how on SAP as a platform, but even beyond that, on a on a system that asks very fundamental questions about the business and our vision about the business and the future of the organization, and then how can automation help us achieve that vision. So thank you very much for that. This wraps up our session for today, and we will start back up tomorrow. Depending where you are in the world, it could be morning, afternoon, or evening, but we're gonna get started at 8 a.m. Eastern time, US time, and we'll cover, let me give you a little bit of a preview. Of course, we don't get started at 8 a.m. tomorrow. We start at 9 a.m. US Eastern time, and we're going to start with a panel discussion that you do not want to miss. It's about automating resilience in banking and financial services. And we're going to have Amit Kumar, who's the Senior Director for Banking and Capital Markets for UiPath. And he's going to be in a panel with a senior leader from Alliance Data on the use of automation, and also the managing director of global digital transformation for JP Morgan Chase, Shefali Shah. And we're going to discuss in that first session how banking and financial services are automating for greater resilience. That will be followed up by reengineering as a methodology to streamline the claims process and identify opportunities for robotics process automation. We'll have a deep dive with Shantanu Kodija, who is the head of operations and enablement for Sun Life's Financial in Asia. So he's going to be broadcasting live on that topic, followed up by advancing market segmentation during and post COVID-19. And that's going to be a session led by a senior leader of corporate strategy and strategic planning at Wells Fargo. Saeed Sanaula is going to be with us and discuss about how Wells Fargo is dealing with the impacts of the pandemic and transforming itself for the supposedly new normal or dislocation that we're going to have post-pandemic times. And then we're going to wrap up tomorrow with a presenter directly from Melbourne, Australia. It will be Beverly Hartson. She is a group credit leader for the Adecco Group, and she's going to be talking about transforming the business of the future. So not just transforming now, but transforming the business of the future. She is going to be talking about the journey of cultural, business, and digital transformation in financial services from a global perspective, looking from the perspective of Australia, but really apply to all other countries as well, and what it takes to have the successful transformation and create this business of the future. So I hope that I get to see you again, or if I don't get to see you, I get to see your questions tomorrow, and I look forward to our interaction throughout the day tomorrow. Thanks everybody for being highly engaged today. We had lots of questions. Again, if some of your questions did not get answered, jump on LinkedIn, look under my name, Jose Perez. I will have a quick update this afternoon on that post about what happened here today. Ask questions if you have questions that weren't answered. If you want to say thank you to the speakers, congratulations, make sure you drop a note there as well. But we'll be back here tomorrow, and with other 4 fantastic set of speakers and presentations. So hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you back tomorrow.